Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about the closed practice Ifa and its relation to the slave trade and how it became practices known as Lukumi, Voodoo, Hoodoo. There's a whole bunch that I don't care to name because honestly, TikTok witches are trifling. They, I'm not going to go off specifically because it's not necessarily all of them. It's a few bad actors that make the whole group look bad. And that could be said about any social media cultist, because at the end of the day, these are supposed to be secrets, you know? That being said, the way IFA is formatted, you don't really get much out of it without the direct guidance of a priest. And I, by no means, am a initiate or a priest. I'm going through the initiation process, but that is my journey and none of your business. And that shows that I actually care about the tradition. I'm taking my time. Now, if anyone would like to learn, I would like to start off by saying that this is a closed practice. And because of the subject matter I'm getting into today, we will be discussing why it's not necessarily meant for white people. The appropriation of this practice, as well as the way it was policed early into slavery, is extremely inhumane, as we could all imagine the experience of being a slave as being. Oftentimes, the enslaved were forced to convert to Christianity, either early on or later into the practice. And now, with the popularization of many indigenous religions as rebranded as magic, really, that it's problematic in one way. If you actually take the time to learn about the religions and how to properly honor gods, you'll find that gods will achieve the things that people normally look for when they seek out magic and magical traditions. This means you could seek other routes. That being said, there are secrets to Ifa. A lot of gods are interconnected, and you cannot give one offerings without consulting another. That is a known rule across a lot of these traditions. And one mistake I see a lot of people beginning to understand the practice making is suggesting that their white friends get into it just for shits and giggles. Now, New Orleans is plagued with a lot of white people appropriating this practice, and I agree with every priest on this. Keep this practice closed. Don't let people in unless they show genuine interest. It's become a genuine trend to go on trips to Caribbean countries and take part in religious ceremonies without actually understanding what the religion is. And it's hard. It's hard to look at someone taking interest in your belief system and tell them they can't be interested, but it's a whole other thing when those people only take the parts that they want. So I hope anyone listening after this point is genuinely interested in a piece of African culture that survived the brutal trip. Um, So let me start off by defining some terms. When I refer to the Orisha, that is a deity, a force of nature, and an aspect of a source god. Just like in other religions, you have a source. And there's also beings closer to primordials that some are still worshipped today. We're going to talk about one that kind of straddles the line and also has aspects of female empowerment to it too. Mind you, these stories take place from like up to thousands of years ago. And what African culture has that European doesn't is there were a lot of societies that honored the feminine. And there are traces of that with deep within European culture, but the advent of Christianity and the policing of it really reinforced it. Not to mention there were really masculinized like times. Like if you think of ancient Greece, there were only certain societies that accepted women as women. And I'm going to be drawing parallels to Greece a lot because that is the a majority accessible tradition for a lot of people. And excuse me if I get anything's wrong, please feel free to correct me in the comments. This is meant to be a discussion, and I don't know, I just have fun using my platform to talk about these deeper subjects with people because a lot of people just don't like to get into it. In order to understand the story, you must understand the relationship four Orisha had together. The primordial form of Yemaya Yemayu, Obatala's primordial form, as well as their first two children, Ogun, the oldest, and Eshu, the youngest. This story has to do with Ogun and kind of an allegory of how iron shaped the world as we know it. So it starts out with Yamaya, Ogun, Eshu, and Obatala all just enjoying their life on a farm, like a primordial farm for gods. And excuse me if these stories aren't necessarily relatable at first. They were written thousands of years ago, so I'm sure there are more modern ways of telling. That. It's also necessary to understand that all these Orisha live together, and it doesn't matter where or what they were doing in the story. What matters is the message behind it. Obatala had a habit of leaving, and every time he would leave his rooster, a rooster to watch over the house. Um, Yamiya had no problem with this. None of the kids had any problem with it. And eventually, Ogun started to get more and more aggressive. He started to take Eshu's portions of food. Then he started to turn on his mother and try and take what belongs to her. Um, this also covers a touchy subject that is very triggering for some people, and I will not be using certain words because of that. But the thing that needs to be known is that when Obatala caught Ogun hurting his mother Yemaya, he realized that he needs to punish Ogun by making him work every day of his life crafting iron. Yemaya, however, was so ashamed of how, like, what happened and that her husband had to see it, that she fell to the earth. The violence and punishment of Ogun is an allegory for how humans' use of iron is itself a punishment. Iron could be used to cut down leaves, but it could also be used to hurt. That being said, the iron we're talking about today isn't a machete, it's chains. A primordial god that became associated with Yemaya throughout the Middle Passage is associated with chains at the bottom of the ocean, and for good reason. And it's said that they're asleep at the bottom of the ocean because they're so frightening and threaten humanity and life on land. Because we'll get into power sets and all that later. Or not. Okay, I hate myself for that a tiny bit. So, the transatlantic slave trade that resulted in an entire population of people separated from their original heritage was started by the Portuguese capitalizing off of an existing set of slave trades throughout Africa. Slaves in Africa were initially prisoners of war or travelers or stateless people. A lot of the times you had a slave trade in the north, which was primarily people from the Middle East trading that. And it was a pretty common practice in general across the world to keep enslaved people. Um, because enslavement is a condition, it is not a type of person. The Portuguese initially traded gold and enslaved people. And the conditions of slaves in Europe were house servants initially. Along with the horrible treatment of human life, they traded some cultural aspects. A good example is puppets. A lot of European traditions use dolls to some extent, and this is reminiscent of what people think of as voodoo dolls, which represent ancestors. It wasn't until Columbus took his voyage to the New World and brought disease and honestly a lot of forced labor to the Native American populations that we see an uptick in the amount of enslaved, and that was as a replacement for the native work. From the start of this country, slaves were used, but it wasn't as popular as it was before the Civil War and even throughout it. This is because tobacco and cotton became cash crops and more slaves needed to come along with it. Cash crops like cotton and tobacco became very profitable, and with a lack of Native Americans, the enslaved Africans came over to farm it. And this led to a blending of beliefs to a certain extent. You have Santeria being a result of forced Christianization of these indigenous religions. And natives also hid their beliefs within that to a certain extent. You also have with this the creation of Lukumi, Voodoo, Hoodoo, Kimbanda, Umbanda, Candomblé, Palo Mayombe. And of course, there are going to be people practicing these beliefs in a very unique way. None of these gods are the same for all of us, but they all share similar names because we had to be able to communicate it to each other, and the creation of Santeria was a result of forced conversions to Christianity. There was a point where all of us had to hide our gods under the mask of saints. And for non initiates, saints are the most accessible versions of these gods. And that's probably the best thing white people could do to honor them. Just stick to Catholicism, honor the saints. And yeah, that being said, it is easy to find open cultural groups that you could practice without offending anything. The next vocabulary word I'd like to bring to y'all is seasoning, the conditioning of the enslaved to be obedient, and it was brutal. Throughout their captivity, slaves were tortured and indoctrinated. Slaves were held for weeks to months before forced deportation from their native lands. Wow, a lot of parallels. And at sea, slave ships followed Columbus's route. The voyage took between 40 days and 6 months. So that's already a huge chunk of time being separated from your culture, your rituals, your practice. These slavers brought Christianity along with them, and part of the conditioning was to make them fit a Christian society. So a lot of rules were forced on. But like no shit, it's slavery. The extent of the slave trade was horrible but subtle at first, and the need for more slaves in the New World just made conditions worse and worse. The enslaved were separated from their land for most of a year, going into their new lives in the New World, similar to the way a lot of us are stuck in quarantine for most of a year. And the parallels continue to be uncanny. Because they were held in captivity for most of the year, the enslaved had to adapt their religions. And this is where you get the crossing over of a lot of African traditions. These crossovers translate into the modern practices that we see today. If you're talking about the Loa, it comes from Ifa partially, but all these traditions serve to preserve different sets of the culture. I know Palo Mayombe, Umbanda, and Kimbanda preserve Congolese tradition. Now, a popular set of stories and spirits, Yemoja specifically, Yemoja, Oya, Eshu, Oshun to a certain extent too, as well as Ogun for his representation of iron. They were all represented within the slave trade to a certain extent. I think Obatala and Olokun also have a pataki within Lukumi traditions that explain some of this. The pataki being that white people or people with lighter skin are the children of both Obatala and Olokun because they resemble the sky, but they hold the secrets of the ocean, which transitions into the slave trade. The enslaved would dread trying to make the journey across to America. The Middle Passage was long and unsanitary, and about a third of the enslaved died before even leaving. A third of them died on the trip, died during the seasoning process. Because of this, it is said that Yemiya tried to protect as many of her children as she could. The ones that were mentally ready to face the horrors of slavery survived. The rest were dragged to the bottoms of the ocean, otherwise known as Olokun's kingdom. And it is said that Olokun's kingdom, the bottom of the ocean, is the it's the world's largest graveyard. It's the place where the most dead have been sent. And even when you think about it, the ocean ultimately comes to swallow up all of our civilizations. It's inevitable. No one's enemy to water, but we'll get more into that in a bit. Now, in order to understand the origins of Yemoja being associated with the slave trade, we have to look at one of her stories. Um, the story goes that Obatala, or in some traditions, Orunmila, they were diviner priests. Everyone in their village came to see them. And while Obatala was gone, Yemoja started to want to learn how to divine. She started to sneak into her husband's divination sessions and learn his secrets. Eventually, it got to the point where she learned how to give her divination herself. And this is the reason children of Yemoja are allowed to divine. Maybe they have prophetic dreams, or they divine because they have an interest. She gave herself the gift of divination, and that's a gift that all of her children carry with them. One way or another, her children have strong instincts, and they are a force to be reckoned with. That being said, these traditions are more complex than just those examples. Throughout the process of worshipping one Orisha, you end up worshipping them all to a certain extent. Now, when Obatala caught Yemoja divining, he ended up getting extremely upset, and Yemoja ran to the beach. Now, this story paints Obatala in a particularly homophobic way, but the reason being is that Yemoja became associated with as the patron of gays because Obatala had an aversion to them. Obatala is very strict and has to do with the divine masculine procreative force. So it's in this story, it serves to say that Yemoja ran to the sea, queer people took her in and protected her from her husband, and ever since she watched over them. Once she ran to the sea, she actually became associated with the Titan, the bottom of the ocean, Olokun, which is the darker sides and the cemeteries we talked about earlier. Not only is Olokun considered gender neutral within the eyes of a lot of priests and traditions, Olokun is the darker sides of the oceans as well as the darker sides of the slave route. Olokun is known as owning a monstrous kingdom where all of Earth's wealth lies. Because the bottom of the ocean is so unseen, and the things that exist there because of the high pressures are so monstrous that we just don't necessarily have a word for it or any connection to it. It's just a primordial land that up until recently has been untouched by humanity, but we have polluted the fuck out of the ocean, and y'all need to act right. Like, y'all really need to act right with this climate change stuff. It's small decisions that impact big corporations at the end of the day. Okay, back on track. The enslaved were kept in vessels that ranged in size, but the trip was the worst part. The rooms the enslaved were kept in were 5 feet high, but at times shelves would be put in to keep more cargo. This reduces the enslaved space to 2.5 feet. The journey took up to 6 months to complete. For the entirety of the 6 months, the enslaved were kept in tight conditions with poor hygiene and a lot of abuse. This led to high fatality rates amongst the enslaved populations, and at its worst, 34% of the enslaved died during the voyage. At its best, 15% died. And it declined to about 5% during the 1800s. But like I mentioned before, there was an underground slave trade that entire time that still exists today. The story of the slave trade from the position of the enslaved was said to be a living hell, with unwashed bodies, dead bodies, and just atrocities. I don't care to say what it was, but considering that it was human bodies, you could imagine the atrocity. Now, going back to the earlier story of Yemoja falling to Earth, she is a symbol of perseverance, especially through the worst of times. Her and other Orisha like her are reminders that no matter who we are and what we go through, we could still get through it. Um, Something should also be said for her darker side. She's such a fierce Orisha because the ocean is a force to be reckoned with. At the end of the day, we don't know the mysteries that lie under there until it's too late. In some translations, Olokun is meant to mean owner of the oceans, but they also serve the purpose of owning secrets. The bottom of the oceans is meant to be a mystery, mystery and wealth. And it's a sign that if you don't face the abyss within, you'll never actually be able to gain wealth. You have to be able to face the hell that is your existence before you can move on and accept your blessings. And that's a lesson that has carried on. This whole world reveres water deities, and it's a symbol of the unconscious as well. But taking it a step further, no matter what culture you come from, you probably have some sense of water. Um, One last story I'd like to leave off on is the story of the Black Madonna. So in Cuba, early into colonization, indoctrinated native saw a vision of a black woman. And it's not said if he's a native, but he was brown on that land. But he saw a vision of a woman coming out of the waves one morning. And this is right after a hurricane. So on the spot, he erected a shrine to the Black Madonna. This was said to be an apparition of the Virgin Mary, but to this day, everyone within Santeria and Lukumi traditions revere her as Yemoja to some extent. So thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I don't feel comfortable sharing my resources with non-initiates or people outside of the bloodline. But if you reach out to me via DM or something, I will reach out to you if I feel it is necessary. But I will say this: the institutions of slavery and the structures that were used hundreds of years ago can still be seen to this day. 400 years ago, Portugal started this mess, maybe even 600 years ago, selling guns to fuel conflict and using slaves. This continues today, and the villain just keeps changing faces. It's very important to be mindful of that, especially when voting this November. The descendants of the enslaved weren't considered people until fairly recently, and I'm talking about 1960 at the earliest. It's it's important to understand that that time period still has its claws in today's contemporary society. And if you want to pick and choose, hey y'all, editing Cameron here. I wanted to give a quick shout out to FNF Botanica. Are interested in? They're currently closed. They've been closed since 2018. The owners have passed away. But they taught me everything I know, and they were a huge influence on everything in this video. I am ready to show you. So I will also do a shameless plug. Here are my two Instagrams up on the screen. Thank you.